Hi there, welcome back for the third and final lecture of the term, which is called Feminism and Power. Now, this is a subject that lies very close to my own heart and to my own research interests, and I hope what's been clear already, given the various different artists and artworks we've looked at, is that questions of gender and sexuality are something that I attend to closely in all aspects of the art that I look at and talk about, not only, and certainly not specifically, work made by self-identifying women who affiliate with the feminist movement. Hopefully we've already begun to see that questions of gender and sexuality open to a far wider pool of participants and identifications that exceed that which we might identify solely as relating to the feminist movement. The feminist movement itself is a historically specific political event. The repercussions and ongoingness, of course, we still feel today, but we're going to be looking at the moment of its emergence and the ways in which women, in particular in the New York art world, began to self-identify as feminist at the moment of the movement's emergence, and the kinds of work they began to produce that spoke more explicitly than anything we've looked at so far to a politics of identity that had important and powerful repercussions not only on the art world and the status of women artists within that world, but speaking more broadly to the achievements and ongoing attainments of the women's liberation movement as it was known then, in terms of striving for equality and recognitions of the differences, the very real differences facing women in the late 60s in terms of how they navigated the world socially, sexually and economically. The artists we're going to be looking at are another trio of American artists. We're going to look at the work of Ida Applebroog, Martha Rosler and Mierle Ukeles Lederman, and we're going to situate their practices, their very different practices, in relation to the rise of the women's movement in and after the late 1960s. We're going to focus in particular on the politics of gender and domesticity, the realm of the domestic. If you remember, we talked about this earlier in relation to Louise Bourgeois' early work and the very real struggles and difficulties that women found in being wives and mothers and expected to run a household at the same time seeking other kinds of professional and creative and intellectual outlets. And we really see women at this moment struggling, perhaps in a way that seems somehow dated, or that moment has passed in some ways, very luckily for a number of us now. But these are women working at a time when it was very difficult to make your voice heard, to count in the same way as your male counterpart, peers, husbands and partners. So the theme of domesticity is the thing, if you recall, that for Bourgeois was a trap, but for others was a refuge. And we see a number of artworks in today's lecture that sees some feminist artists playing very wittily and very powerfully with the idea of a woman's place being in the kitchen. These are three important artists who each challenged the ways in which the female body has been appropriated, exploited, depicted, and made absent from the visual realm as well as the economic and social realm. Through subversive means, they each produced works that tackled directly the sexism of the home and the art world to funny, angry, and very powerful ends. In particular, we're going to focus on Ida Applebroog's sinister works, and I really do think they are sinister in their quiet, discomforting manner and the way in which she presents these unsettling scenarios that address the politics of power as they dominate the home and workplace. And I'm showing you a classic example from her Sure, I'm Sure performance from 1979. We've leapt forward a little bit here. I'll be talking about Ida in a moment. We'll also look at Martha Rosler's assaults on the politics of domesticity, and we'll watch her film Semiotics of the Kitchen, her video, sorry, it's not a film, it's a video, from 1975, and then Lederman's performance of domestic labour in public spaces such as museums, and you see her in an iconic shot now from 1973 of her washing the steps of a museum. We're following on from that previous lecture to reflect on some key themes that run throughout the works we're considering, to do with art and its challenges to history and the status quo, and the ways in which artists have used the body and its absence to tackle questions about power and history. And again, we're looking at a trio of artists to draw out some shared themes and questions that their work raises, specifically this time relating to the intersection of gender, the body, power and violence. So the images I'm showing you here, first by Ida Applebroog. This is an artist that I've worked on a lot. She's now in her late 80s and still going strong. Martha Rosler was younger. She's just in her 70s now, and she's still very active as an artist, teacher, and very, very powerful political activist. And third, Mierle Ukeles Lederman, whose practice will conclude to draw our thoughts together. Something to note is that all three of these women identified explicitly with feminism in the 1970s as the women's liberation movement developed. So the women's liberation movement came about through various different stages and incremental changes. Often in the United States, it's associated in the post-war era with Betty Friedan, who very famously published her book The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which comprised a series of interviews with recent female college graduates who had dropped out almost exclusively. They'd all dropped out of college after marrying and were now finding themselves in the domestic realm. And as Friedan interviewed them, she began to realise that what seemed to be the perfect life was being experienced as anything but by these women who had abandoned their studies and were now home alone, surrounded by domestic appliances or rearing children, lonely and wondering what it was that they were missing. Friedan said they couldn't put their finger on it, and Friedan famously coined this as the problem that has no name. That name, subsequently, we have for that feeling, was addressed most explicitly through a feminist politics. Friedan was the founder of the National Organisation for Women. They rallied and marched. They had demands in the 60s to be met to do with the legalisation of abortion, equality of pay and free childcare. These claims and the commitment of the National Organisation for Women was challenged and redirected in some ways by the late 60s when the radical feminist movement emerged. Now, the radical feminist movement had many shared sympathies with Friedan's movement, but they were more radical, as the name suggests. They weren't seeking to simply be treated the same as men, but to insist on a wholesale shake-up of the ways in which society, the patriarchy as they named it, is being used to exploit women. This wasn't about women struggling and grappling to have something like the same as their male counterparts, but to radically overhaul the very structures of society, the very notion that the family unit should look the way it does. And as such, this blew open questions about reproduction, same-sex relationships, and an utter critique of the ways in which the patriarchal order had, they argued, confined and restricted women. For the women's liberation movement, there was a very strong sense that good politics begins at home, in the sphere of the domestic, not just the public. That is, politics doesn't only happen in the public arena, it also takes place in the private and domestic space of the home. And Patricia Mainardi famously argued that participatory democracy begins at home. The argument was that women can begin to radicalise from the ground up within their own home by the refusal to take on household tasks, by the refusal to assume that their role is to be the primary child care or the carer full stop within the home. There was an insistence that they should be paid for the housework they were undertaking in lieu of the salary they weren't able to be picking up in a job because they were tasked with the full-time emotional, economic and practical running of the family and the home. Now, you'll recall in our earlier discussions of gender and the abstract erotic, we read Lucy Lippard's important essay about her equally important exhibition from 1966, Eccentric Abstraction. There, abstraction and the body were talked about in psychological and formal terms. Now, interestingly, in the early 1970s, Lucy Lippard began to identify with the newly emerging women's movement, and she, as in her own words, came out as a feminist in the very late 60s, and she began from that point on to redress her entire worldview, and she continues to be now both a very important writer and critic of art, but a dedicated, passionate and incredibly influential feminist, critic and activist. And so we really see in Eccentric Abstraction the very first work that Lippard began to do that suggested something of a stirring, of an interest, a questioning of the role of gender and sexuality, that just a few years later, once she's been exposed to the radical feminism that's beginning to appear around her, she begins to identify explicitly as a feminist, and so belongs rightly to this group that we're looking at today. Now, the realm of the domestic is so important here because of the place that women have historically found and been allocated within the home. The home is where women are considered to be best placed. Now, this questioning of the domestic entrapment of women goes back longer than the 1960s women's movement. The British writer Virginia Woolf wrote her essay in 1929, A Room of One's Own, which is considered a very famous early feminist defence in its argument for both a literal and a figurative space for women writers within a literary tradition dominated by men. Now, some of you might know the argument of this essay, but for Woolf, she says, what women need is the space and the economic means to be able to work, to be able to write, to be able to create. These two things, as a room of one's own, and the means, the economic means, however modest, to be able to afford that time alone in one's room, metaphoric or literal, is the only way in which women can begin to achieve anything like the creative space and recognition that their contemporaries have, freed from the trappings of domestic drudgery. So I'm reminding us all here of the wonderful painting, the Femme Maison by Louise Bourgeois, which spoke very poignantly to Bourgeois' own anxiety at leaving her home in France for the United States, as well as juggling the demands of being a wife, a mother, and an artist. Who keeps house might be one question these architectonic personages ask. Who keeps house? Who's in charge? Whose responsibility does this fall to? And Bourgeois' subsequent reclaiming as a feminist happens in 1976 when Lucy Lippard illustrates the cover of that collection of essays with one of the Femme Maison images. And at this moment we really see Bourgeois being reclaimed as a feminist. Now, Louise Bourgeois absolutely respected and spoke out on behalf of the feminist movement in the early 1970s. But remember, in the earlier 60s, artists such as Bourgeois, Eva Hesse, Yayoi Kusama, they're beginning to establish themselves at a time before the feminist politics, before feminism became a political identity that you might attach yourself to. And so what they understood themselves was as in a slightly more earlier feminist mode, more aligned with Simone de Beauvoir's writing, existentialist writing about what it is to be a woman, which didn't quite lend Bourgeois, Hesse and Kusama to describing themselves as feminist, but nonetheless did provide them something of a sense of what it was to struggle as a woman and to understand this as an explicitly feminist politics, which Bourgeois certainly did much later on. And I'm just showing you a classic photograph here from one of those women's marches, judge women as people, not as wives, and the cover, the early cover of Betty Friedan's feminine Mystique. Here's a quotation for you from Friedan's Feminine Mystique from 1963, and I'll just read that out loud for you. Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to even ask of herself the silent question, is this all? So we're going to look at some of Ida Applebroog's work now, a very interesting artist who began working in the 1960s. She had a very interesting career before then. Unusually, Ida is one of the few artists we look at today who did have a professional career as a younger woman. She worked on Madison Avenue in an advertising firm. So she was one of these archetypal, very few ambitious young women who worked with the madmen of New York City. And it was really there that she honed her graphic skills, which we see in her work later on. She recounts in an anecdote, in fact, that when she decided to quit the advertising agency to instead focus her energies on being an artist, it was far too difficult to explain that to her male peers in the advertising agency, who simply assumed that when she handed her notice in, it was because she was getting married and going to have a family. And she still has her farewell card, which is the most extraordinary document of the time, in which it's full of references to all best wishes for your upcoming nuptials. We look forward to the pitter-patter of tiny feet, where she found this quite alarming and slightly funny because she was actually resigning in order to take up a part-time job in a local library so that she could fund her work and her studies as an artist. She had no such intentions for moving straight into the realm of the domestic. But what she did notice and learned at this time is the ways in which the female body is subjected to scrutiny, a specific kind of scrutiny. And I think working in the advertising world in the 1950s would certainly have made that point clear. Now, we're looking at a work called the American Medical Association 1. It's a diptych, which means it has two discrete but conjoined panels. They're two printed sheets, and the left-hand sheet is printed in black ink, and it shows three seated men in suits in front of a screen of a naked woman with her eyes masked, and the right-hand sheet, in white ink, shows a male medical figure in a white coat, his small finger in his mouth. This is a lino-cut print on two sheets of thick oriental paper, which is some of the best, most expensive paper that one can work with. This is her technique, her materials are very important to Applebroog. This is a work, though, that's about power and the male gaze. The female is a body only. She can't see, her eyes are masked. She's just a body, a naked body, which the absolutely not naked men who are clearly wearing suits are free to observe and to stare at. Now, what's going on here, we don't know, but there is a sense that the body is somehow the subject of a particular kind of medical gaze. Now, bearing in mind that from the 60s onwards, the female body as a battlefield had been a familiar rallying cry of the feminist movement, I think we might want to think about this as a comment on that, the ways in which what happens to women's bodies is determined for them by others, by the medical profession, by the patriarchy, by men. And you recall the National Organisation for Women's March, one of those demands for free access to a legal abortion process, I think is something that lays at the heart of a number of these questions about sexual liberation and freedom that marks much of Applebroog's work. This is from 1985. Now, Applebroog has this interesting career. By the late 60s, she's moved from New York to California because her husband has a job as a university professor. And she finds herself at that time with 4 children, and she's looking after them all at home, and she's starting to struggle. Now, a number of her works after this period, where she has what she describes very powerfully as a series of nervous breakdowns, she emerges from this with a very clear political conscience, a very clear sense that her art needs to express what she is feeling and thinking and seeing about the world around her. And we see that in works where she returns to themes over again, whether from 1968, 1974 or 2012, as with the work Catastrophe from the Catastrophe series that we're looking at here. And again, the medicalised body is something that is being treated very differently with the male subject on the left. In the lab, we have the lab coat wearing doctor, the discreetly, modestly covered male body nude save for the towel, and then the rather more aggressive, violent treatment of the female subject on the other side, who seems to be attacked instead with a hammer. Very different ways of treating the body that we see here. Now, there's a kind of subversive humour at moments in Applebroog's work, but largely it's a very disquieting sense of violence that runs through her figurative practice. This is the case with what she calls her performances. Now, these were a series of books, very cheaply printed books that reproduced works that she had made on a larger scale. Now, she would send these books or performances unbidden to strangers or people that she'd met without a note or explanation. They would simply open this in the mail and they would read, "Sure, I'm sure, a performance, Ida Applebroog." They'd then open this book. It has maybe 6 to 10 pages maximum. And what you see inside is often the same image repeated or slightly different. And in this one, I think what's clear is this disquieting sense of eroticism that actually seems charged by questions of consent and anxiety. Does this feel like an erotic scene we're looking at? A scene of threat and violence? Or a scene of resignation? "Sure, I'm sure" is the title, and the more one thinks about it and looks between the text and the image, the more unsettling it becomes. She also incorporates blank pages into some of these performances, and they're like a pause or giving you a moment to catch your breath before the unsettling story moves on. Those blank pages read as silence. "But I wasn't there" is another one. And we see that familiar stage set scenario that she reproduces inside the books. She likes the idea that her figurative works seem to present a narrative that we aren't clear of, that we don't know where we're headed, we don't know where we've come from. She says it's almost like you've been plunged into the middle of a narrative and you have to somehow work it out for yourself. This uncertainty is not in the case of Ida Applebroog at the level of abstraction, but at the level of not knowing where the scene depicted fits into the bigger picture. Applebroog says that all her work is about power. This is an absolute constant in every interview, in every conversation. Whatever the subject matter, it can be boiled down to a question of power. Who has the power? Who's in control? Who's in charge? And I think this is something that you could think about in relation to a number of the works we've looked at in this block of lectures, in terms of who's in control of the meaning and the ways in which that work is mediated and understood. Now I'm just showing you a photograph of the shop and gallery Printed Matter in New York City. Now, this is to give you a sense of the original size of those images from Sure, I'm Sure and the other works. They're on vellum, thick sheets of vellum, and they're very, very large. So they're in the windowed. If you see, they've been mounted almost as though blinds or shutters to the passers-by. And it was these works that Applebroog had reduced down to reproduce in the series of books that she would mail out to make people uncomfortable. And just a reminder of the levels of ambiguity in her work, which, like Grossman's Heads or Melvin Edwards and Lee Bontecue's relief works, contain an implied violence, although, as we've just noted in Applebroog's case, it's the idea that's abstract rather than the material, than the image itself. Here's another deeply unusual work from her Living series. This is dated, and it looks like a calendar. Do you see those post-it notes that are dated around the side? They're like domestic to-do lists, except when you read them, they make no sense. This is the domestic sphere made strange. This is a triptych. This is a 3-panelled work, and that central one, you see where she paints a form and whites it out, and then paints over the top and whites it out. So you have this kind of layering of memories, of thoughts that don't quite come to the foreground. It's entirely uncertain what's happening, but when you light upon particular scenarios and instances, again, questions of the blindfold or silencing, questions of consent. Is this a couple in an embrace or an attack? What are we witnessing here? These are the kinds of questions that she folds into the domestic realm of the homely calendar, and across this series we see similar disturbing images. Now I show you 2 drawings here that are from Applebroog's Mercy Hospital series. Now, these are dated 2016 to 17 because this is the date that Applebroog rediscovered these drawings in her studio, drawings that in fact she first made in 1969 while in hospital for a nervous breakdown, that nervous breakdown I mentioned earlier that she experienced in California. This is a very poignant body of work. The reason she made so many of these drawings at the time was when she was put into hospital, she found herself unable to speak. And so her psychiatrist suggested instead she draw, knowing that she was wanting to be an artist. And so she did, page after page, filled with desperate, anxious and entirely astonishing images. And you see just 2 examples here. Now, I won't say more about these because there is much to say about them, and I've written quite a lot about these. But what you can do for now is go to the Freud Museum that is just at Finchley Road Tube Station in London, where for a time these drawings are actually on show in Freud's London residence. It's a wonderful museum if you haven't been there before, and there's a room full of these drawings, and I think it's really wonderful that they've been installed in the home of Freud, the classic psychoanalytic founder, because really these are works that demand to be taken seriously as an artist, as someone grappling with their unconscious anxieties and fears in a way that even just now, by 2016 to 17, Applebroog is able to begin to return to and address. They were too difficult to do previously. And for her, these are absolutely a kind of feminist cry. This is a moment where the domestic and the pressures that she's finding herself under became too much. And it was after 1969, a couple of years later, the family relocate to New York, and by the early 70s Applebroog is absolutely full-time committed to working as an artist and deeply involved with Heresies, the feminist collective of artists in the city, and begins to be a very political artist. Now, the domestic featured in other ways in the New York art world, not least of all in the world of pop, particularly pop art by male as well as female artists. Now, I'm showing you here a very famous installation shot of Klaus Oldenburg's first ever exhibition of his oversized stuffed sculpture that was held at the Green Gallery in 1962. Now, what you see here, and I'll just identify a few of my favourites, are the pistachio ice cream, the floor cake, and then right at the foreground on the floor to the right we have double cheeseburgers with everything. They're made from paper mache. And hanging at the back on the left-hand wall is a giant oversized pair of blue men's trousers. There's a shirt and tie draped over a chair in the centre. Now, it's interesting that this is really a classic, important moment in pop art, the bringing of the ordinary, everyday and domestic into the sphere of fine art. But it's never talked about in gendered terms, even though the domestic is absolutely considered at this time to be the realm of the woman. Yet it's the male artist who has taken that realm and turned it into pop art. When we see someone like Kusama working with domestic imagery, such as her armchair, which we met previously, she instead does something rather different. This isn't a playful pop rendering, but rather a disturbing, nightmarish vision of what happens when your environment becomes colonized, crawling with these strange phallic forms. Martha Rosler is an artist who trained at art school in California and was immediately a very politicised artist. Her politics and her maturity as a political artist coincided with the women's movement, unlike Applebroog, who was a generation older and somewhat she came of age in a different moment, although her politics in the 70s absolutely chimed with those of the younger Rosler. And what we see here is Martha Rosler seeing what's happening in the realm of pop, the ways in which the domestic sphere has been turned into bright, vivid, playful scenarios, and she subverts it by making a feminist statement. So what we have here is vacuuming pop art. So she's used a collage technique, and the walls are covered with posters and images by male pop artists, while the female figure happily demonstrates her new Hoover by cleaning the environment. Except the suggestion of vacuuming pop art suggests too a sense in which she might be trying to erase its very place, and the smile on the face of the female figure, who's clearly been cut from a magazine advertising domestic appliances, feels a bit more subversive once cut and pasted and renamed by Rosler. She did another group of works that I think bear interesting comparison to those of Oldenburg. This is the Hot Meat and the Cold Meat series from her Body Beautiful series of photo collages as well as objects. So what we see here is an image of a cooker and a fridge, and she's covered them with these images of naked female bodies taken from pornographic magazines. So the idea of the cooker being the place where one prepares hot meat is subversively compared to the idea that perhaps the naked female body functions as hot meat instead. So here, this overlaying of the domestic and the female body takes on a very different form. And I think this series of works are an important example of how Rosler was able to use pop art to make very strong feminist statements about the ways in which the female body is objectified in society. And these early works laid the groundwork for her later involvement in the 70s in the feminist movement. With a jarring visual metaphor, Rosler links the female body to food-related items like pieces of meat, as though both are simple commodities for male pleasure and consumption. And in addition, that connection of the female body to the domestic realm of the kitchen serves to reinforce the narrow view still prevalent in the 60s of woman as housekeeper, defined only by her role as mother, nurturer, and home provider. When she described this aspect of the series, Rosler said, "I should think that the reading of woman equals good mother equals food is apparent in the kitchen set. You might say its theme is consumption." I just show you perhaps the most stark counter to Rosler's work, and perhaps one way of putting it is to say, look at what women artists were up against. This is the artist Alan Jones' very well-known trilogy of sculptures that were issued as editions. One could buy these for your home. They were very expensive, but nonetheless they were available. And here we have a coffee table, a hat stand, and a stool. But what we really see are pornographic, aggressive treatments of the female body that are very much connected to a language of pop and playful frivolity, but I think they read now as incredibly problematic works, as they did then. And Alan Jones certainly came in for some serious critique by the feminist movement in ways that perhaps are quite obvious at this point here. In In 1974, Martha Rosler made a video. It was called Semiotics of the Kitchen. It's about 6 minutes long. And interestingly, she filmed this in Ida Applebroog's kitchen. Such was this process of collaboration and exchange that took place at this time. And we're just going to watch this film together. And what I want you to think about is the intersection of humour and violence, the growing aggression that builds and mounts towards the end of this film, as well as Rosler's very funny take on the idea of the semiotics, which is a structuralist term that at this time is very much coming over in critical theory from Europe, which Rosler here turns towards not novels or literature, but to the domestic semiotics of the kitchen.
Apron. Bowl. Chopper. Dish. Egg beater. Fork. Grater. Hamburger press. Ice pick. Juicer. Knife. Ladle. Measuring implements. Nutcracker. Opener. Pen. Quart bottle. Rolling pin. Spoon. Tenderizer. U. V. W. X. Y. Z.
So you see something of the wit and humour that is important to Rosler's practice as she increasingly treats those kitchen appliances with a fury, ending with that slashing Z for Zorro to finish the film, but that sort of playful shrug at the end to alert us to the fact that there's a humour running through that practice too. She was basing the format on something that we're perhaps very familiar with now, but not so much at the time. It was really the emergence of the new cookery TV show, and in particular Julia Child, who she's making fun of here, who is a very characterful chef who introduced French cuisine to the American middle classes and was always filmed behind the counter in this very didactic manner. And I'm just showing you a photograph of Ida Applebroog sitting at the very spot in her Crosby Street apartment in Soho in New York, from behind which Rosler made semiotics of the kitchen. Interestingly, Applebroog lived here separate to the family home a couple of streets away. This was where she would spend time working and often living away from the family in order to do her work, to get away from the domestic realm. And so for someone who had a series of children and a husband, here she is having coffee on her own in her own space, which she lent to other feminists to work in. I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of other photo collages by Martha Rosler, perhaps her best known works after Semiotics of the Kitchen, which is part of the House Beautiful. So we've seen the Body Beautiful series. Here's the House Beautiful, bringing the war home. Now this iconic series consists of 20 photo montages that she conceived in the 60s and 70s during a time of increased intervention by the United States military in Vietnam, something we've mentioned in a few instances over this course of lectures. So this series combines pictures of Vietnamese citizens who've been mutilated by war that Rosler cut out from Life magazine, a glossy magazine that would land on the doorsteps of many, many Americans and really was a key source of information, of reportage and knowledge of what was going on around the world. And so these images of warfare, of violence, are interspersed with scenes of the homes of wealthy Americans that makes literal the description of this as the living room war, which was a term used in the United States to describe how Americans perceived the ongoing bloodshed in Southeast Asia through televised news reports, which brought the outside world inside the home. And Rosler has taken that to its absurd, most horrifying extreme by showing behind, for instance, the curtains outside the window, just beyond the home, is where this violence is happening, and it muddles up notions of here and there, the idea that this war is somehow elsewhere. Instead, it's been brought right back into the home to the ordinary American, make clear what the military intervention is doing. And there's just a close-up of that, a very well-known photograph that we see here of the injured child being carried here up the stairs. Okay, a very different kind of domesticity is at work in the last couple of works we're just going to touch on by Mierle Ukeles, who in 1969 wrote a manifesto for maintenance art. This was a proposal that belonged as part of an exhibition on the theme of care, which again took place in 1969. Now, this was really... it was after this manifesto that Ukeles rose to prominence after Art Forum published the Manifesto for Maintenance Art. In it, the artist, a new mother, described the dissonance she experienced between the life of freedom and creativity she craved as an artist and the never-ending monotonous tasks that she also encountered as a mother and wife. And she used the manifesto to expand her definition of art to include domestic labour, and she called this maintenance art, so that her life as a mother and wife would not conflict with her life as an artist. She said, "I will simply do these everyday things and flush them up to consciousness, exhibit them as art." Now, the manifesto sparked a series of important performances in which Ukeles carried out housekeeping tasks at a museum, cooking, washing the stairs, the floors, dusting the vitrines containing the museum's display exhibits, making this normally ignored activity visible and public. She took the dictum, "the personal is political," a real rallying cry of the women's movement, to heart. And with these acts, she pioneered service art, which is something she single-handedly produced, which was a wider art movement consisting of the performance of service tasks. Here is that manifesto you see, just simply typed up, that exclamation mark signalling this is a bold statement that's being made. The idea that service art, that maintenance art, simply maintaining the domestic sphere, can perhaps be its own form of art. A very radical claim that she was making at this time, very playful conceptual claim, although in Italy in the 1970s this was taken up by the radical women's movement there, who orchestrated a very powerful campaign under Federici in particular, which absolutely established a campaign for being paid for housework, something that we continue to hear about as a very powerful political movement that gets discussed and returns at various moments. This is part of the Touch Sanitation project. And now for this performance, the artist spent 11 months shaking hands with and thanking all of New York City's sanitation workers, all 8,500 of them. She methodically mapped out her routes, and she spent 8 to 16 hours every day visiting sanitation crews in different areas. She shadowed the workers, she interviewed them, she delivered speeches about her own work and the value of theirs. "Thank you for keeping New York City alive," she told every one of them. And in 1977, the Department of Sanitation made her their first artist in residence. It's not a paid post, but through this position, the artist seeks to shed light on the work that the sanitation people do to keep the city alive, to draw attention to the invisible labour, so extending her politics and commitment not only to women and caregivers, but those who continue to do the care of the community in invisible ways. This is the domestic on a more public scale. And here we see another instance from that project. So just to return to that final group of images, perhaps we might think a little bit about how some of the themes and strands that we've looked at today might speak to the the other lectures that we've looked at, in which questions of abstraction and politics also came into play, perhaps in different ways. And some themes that you might want to think about include perhaps a question: is there something more intrinsically political to the works by Applebroog, Rosler, Ukeles, simply because they use images, figuration, aspects of narrative, however much they might pervert or play with that? Is there something intrinsically more political to this than a more abstract mode of art making? Do Melvyn Edwards' works lack a certain political precision because he refuses to give them narrative meaning, to insist that they are only about one thing? Or is there a politics to his refusal to let the works, the lynch fragments, identify so explicitly with his own status as an African-American man? Equally, is it wrong that Eva Hesse and Yayoi Kusama thought that their works in the early to mid-1960s had another form of address that should not and could not just be reduced to a question of feminism or gender, but that in fact spoke to more unconscious aspects of desire and play that don't necessarily belong exclusively to the female artist? Perhaps questions raised by Nancy Grossman's works as autobiographical tackle this question head on. What are we supposed to do with works that refuse to settle as one gender or the other? Does this open onto other conversations, ways of queering the conversation, as David Getsy has argued, to think outside of those binary divisions that to the early moments of the women's liberation movement seemed entirely obvious and necessary, but today speak to a perhaps outdated mode of thinking through questions of gender and gender fluidity, something that Grossman seemed keenly aware of in her early leather-bound, strapped heads. Again, she called them autobiographical, but really is a distancing device, perhaps to draw the viewer's attention to the fact that we tend to automatically project onto the artwork something of the artist's own agency and identity. Now, the fact that Applebroog describes her works as being always about power is something that we might think about in relation to a number of themes addressed over these 3 lectures: the uneven power balance, the questions of the intersection of agency and artistic endeavour, the ways in which we understand the artist's involvement in their work of art as reducible to themselves, or perhaps, again, to return to that feminist slogan, the personal is political, to understand their works as taking an own lived experience of their own, but using this to expand to a broader set of references, something that another audience can understand and relate to. Questions of abstraction, sexuality, gender and race, and their critical intersections at various moments have been key themes running through these lectures, although we've gone in different directions. And I just want to close by reminding you of something I said at the very beginning, which is that while we've focused on quite a narrow period of time and on art made exclusively in the United States, what we have developed is a toolkit, a conceptual and verbal toolkit for you in writing about, thinking about and reading about art from this period, but also much contemporary art, as so many contemporary artists look to the 60s and 70s as a pivotal moment in the development of an avant-garde art that sought to ask new, complex questions relating to gender, relating to questions of race and sexuality, and that you can use some of the themes and ideas and vocabulary developed over these 3 lectures as you go into galleries and museums and try to make sense of various other kinds of practice, both abstract and figurative, as we develop ways of writing about and thinking through different and new art forms.